A 2.8 trillion parameter model just walked out of a Chinese AI lab and did something almost no open weight system has ever managed before. It actually beat one of Anthropic's flagship models on independent, publicly verifiable benchmarks. And just as that story was breaking across the tech world, an entirely separate race was quietly accelerating in the background, one involving quantum computers instead of chatbots, with the same two countries once again facing off against each other. Today we are breaking down exactly what happened with Moonshot AI's new Kimi K3 model, how it actually stacks up against Claude Opus 4.8 once you look past the headlines, and why quantum computing has suddenly become impossible to separate from this same broader competition between American and Chinese technology. Stick around, because this story is a lot more nuanced than a simple win, or loose headline suggests, and the quantum angle at the end genuinely changes how you should think about the whole race. Let's start with Kimi K3 itself, because the scale of this model alone makes it worth understanding before we even get to the benchmark results. Moonshot AI, the Chinese company behind Kimi, released K3 on July the 16th of this year. And the headline number that immediately grabbed attention was its size. At 2.8 trillion parameters, it is the largest open-weight language model ever released, dramatically larger than most of its closed-source competitors, including the very Claude models it is now being compared against. Being open-weight means Moonshot has made the underlying model files available for anyone to download, inspect, modify, and run on their own hardware. A fundamentally different distribution approach than Anthropic's Claude models, which remain closed and accessible only through official channels like the API or Claude's own chat interface. This distinction between open-weight and closed models carries real practical consequences worth understanding before diving into the specific benchmark comparisons. An open-weight model like K3 can be downloaded and run entirely on a company's own hardware, meaning organizations with strict data privacy requirements, or those operating in regions with limited, reliable internet connectivity to external API services, gain genuine independence from relying on any single company's servers staying operational and accessible. That same openness also means outside researchers can directly inspect the model's actual weights, verify performance claims independently, and even fine-tune the permission for Moonshot itself. Closed models like Claude, by contrast, trade away that flexibility in exchange for tighter control over how the model gets used, generally more consistent performance and safety behavior across different deployment contexts, and the ability for the company maintaining the model to continue improving and patching it centrally without requiring every single user to manually download and install a new version themselves. Now let's get into the actual benchmark results, because this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting rather than just impressive on paper. On the Artificial Analysis Intelligence Index, a widely referenced composite score built from 9 different evaluations, covering everything from coding to scientific reasoning to long context understanding, Kimi K3 scored approximately 57 points, narrowly, ahead of Claude Opus 4.8's approximately 56 points. That is a real result, but it is worth immediately noting how narrow that gap actually is, essentially a single point separating the two models on a composite scale where dozens of individual evaluations get blended together into one overall number. Both models actually sit behind 2 other systems on this same index. Anthropic's own, Claude Fable 5 at roughly 60 points, and OpenAI's GPT 5.6, Sol at roughly 59 points, meaning Kimi K3's win over Opus 4.8, specifically, still leaves it in 4th place overall among the current top tier of frontier AI models. It is worth understanding a bit about how these composite intelligence indices actually get built, since that context helps explain why a single point difference deserves genuine caution rather than being treated as a decisive verdict. The Artificial Analysis Intelligence Index specifically blends together evaluations covering agentic task completion, banking and financial reasoning scenarios, terminal and command line operation, scientific coding challenges, an extremely difficult general knowledge test called Humanity's Last Exam, graduate-level physics and chemistry questions, a specialized reasoning benchmark called CRIT-PT, a factual, reliability measure called AA Omniscience, and a long context comprehension test. Averaging performance across 9 genuinely different evaluation types into one single number inevitably smooths over meaningful variation in exactly where each model actually excels or struggles, which is precisely why looking only at that one composite score rather than examining the individual evaluation results underneath it can create a somewhat misleading picture of how these two models actually compare across the different kinds of tasks people might realistically want to use them for. Beyond that single headline number, the more detailed benchmark breakdown reveals a genuinely mixed picture rather than a clean, decisive victory for either model. Kimi K3. perform particularly well on coding-related evaluations, taking the top spot on something called the Front-End Code Arena, a benchmark where actual human developers vote blind on which model produced better website code without knowing which AI generated which result. K3 won that specific matchup against Claude Fable 5, and 76% of head-to-head comparisons, a genuinely impressive result precisely because it comes from real human judgment rather than an automated scoring system that companies could potentially optimize their models around. K3 also posted the strongest open weight result ever recorded on a difficult graduate-level science reasoning test called GPQA Diamond, reaching 93.5% accuracy. However, the picture looks considerably different once you dig into benchmarks measuring factual reliability rather than RAW coding or reasoning capability. Independent testing found that while Kimi K3's overall accuracy improved meaningfully compared to its predecessor model, climbing from around 33% up to roughly 46%, its tendency to confidently state incorrect information, something researchers call the hallucination rate, actually climbed as well, reaching approximately 51% on certain evaluations. Compare that to Claude Opus 4.8, which posted a considerably stronger 64% non-hallucination rate on a benchmark called AA, appropriately uncertain, roughly 2/3 of the time on questions specifically designed to probe for confident, incorrect answers. For anyone planning to actually deploy one of these models in a business setting where factual reliability genuinely matters, the difference in hallucination behavior carries real practical weight, regardless of how the two models compare on more narrowly defined coding or reasoning benchmarks. This trade-off between raw capability improvement and factual reliability is one of the more subtle but genuinely important patterns showing up across recent AI model releases from multiple companies, not just this specific comparison. As models get pushed to handle increasingly ambitious, open-ended tasks, particularly tasks involving long-horizon reasoning or extended autonomous operation without human supervision. At every step, there is often a real tension between making a model more capable at attempting difficult tasks and keeping that same model appropriately cautious about admitting uncertainty rather than confidently generating a plausible sounding but ultimately incorrect answer. A model that appropriately says it does not know something is, in many real-world business contexts, considerably more useful and trustworthy than a model that always produces a confident-sounding response, regardless of whether that response actually reflects genuine underlying certainty. This is precisely the kind of practical, deployment-relevant consideration that tends to get lost entirely in headlines that simply announce one model beat another, without ever examining what specific trade-offs that particular model made in order to achieve its headline-grabbing score. There is also an important methodology detail that responsible reporting on this comparison needs to acknowledge directly, because it significantly affects how much confidence you should place in some of these headline numbers. Many of Moonshot's most favorable coding benchmark results were generated using the company's own custom testing framework, called Kimi Code, rather than the more widely used, independently maintained testing harnesses that Claude's scores are typically measured against. On one specific benchmark called Terminal Bench 2.1, for example, Kimi K3 posted an impressive 88.3% score using its own Kimi Code harness, while Claude Opus 4.8's verified, independently published score on the same benchmark using a publicly available testing framework called Claude Code came in at 78.9%. That gap sounds significant, but comparing a vendor's self-reported result on their own custom testing tool against a competitor's independently verified score on a public leaderboard is not really an apples-to-apples comparison, since the testing harness itself, covering things like available tools, retry logic, and timeout handling, can meaningfully influence the final score almost as much as the underlying model's actual capability does. To understand why testing harness differences matter so much, it helps to think about what an agentic coding benchmark actually measures, beyond just the underlying language model's raw intelligence. These benchmarks typically ask a model to complete complex, multi-step coding tasks, often involving reading through an existing codebase, identifying a bug, writing a fix, and then verifying that fix actually works correctly, sometimes across dozens of individual steps. The surrounding software scaffold that manages this process, deciding how many attempts the model gets before giving up, how it handles error messages returned by the code it wrote, and how much context about the surrounding code base it can access at once, can dramatically influence the final success rate almost independently of how capable the underlying language model actually is at the core coding task itself. A well-tuned custom harness, built specifically to complement one particular model's strengths, can meaningfully boost that model's measured performance compared to a more generic, publicly available testing framework that was not specifically optimized around that same model's particular quirks and tendencies. This is exactly why serious AI researchers increasingly emphasize looking at results from shared, independently maintained public benchmarks, rather than accepting vendor-reported numbers generated, using a company's own proprietary testing infrastructure at face value. This distinction between vendor-reported numbers and independently verified numbers matters enormously across nearly every comparison being made between these two models right now. At the time Moonshot first announced K3, the actual model weights needed for outside researchers to independently verify these claims were not even available yet, only arriving roughly 10 days after the initial announcement. That gap between announcement and independent verification is a familiar pattern across the AI industry, where companies naturally want to generate excitement and press coverage around a new release, while the harder, more time-consuming work of independent replication and verification necessarily happens somewhat later, once outside researchers actually get their hands on the model itself. Some of the comparisons circulating in the days immediately following K3's launch were built entirely on Moonshot's own self-reported numbers, which is worth keeping in mind before accepting any single headline claim about this model completely at face value. Cost is one area where Kimi K3's advantage looks considerably more clear-cut and less dependent on which specific testing methodology you trust. K3 costs roughly 40% less per token to run compared to Claude Opus 4.8, and that price advantage holds up across most published cost comparisons, regardless of which broader capability benchmark you happen to be looking at alongside it. For businesses and developers running enormous volumes of AI, powered tasks, where costs scale directly with usage, that kind of consistent price difference can matter just as much as small differences in raw benchmark scores, especially for tasks where either model performs adequately well, and the deciding factor becomes overall cost efficiency at scale rather than squeezing out the absolute highest possible capability score. There is an important nuance worth adding here about total cost of ownership, though, since raw per token pricing does not always tell the complete financial story for every organization considering these two models. Because Kimi K3 is open weight, an organization choosing to self-host the model rather than access it through a third-party API provider needs to factor in the substantial costs of the specialized graphics processing hardware required to actually run a model this large, along with the engineering expertise needed to properly deploy, maintain, and optimize that infrastructure over time. For a smaller company or individual developer without existing infrastructure and specialized machine learning engineering talent already in place, those upfront and ongoing infrastructure costs can sometimes outweigh the per-token savings that make K3 look so attractive on a simple price per million tokens comparison chart. Claude Opus 4.8, by contrast, requires no infrastructure investment at all beyond a standard API subscription, since Anthropic handles all of the underlying hosting, scaling, and maintenance. Work behind the scenes, which is exactly why many smaller engineering teams and businesses without dedicated infrastructure teams continue defaulting toward hosted closed models like Opus, even when a cheaper open weight alternative technically exists on paper. There is also a meaningful operational difference between the two models that goes beyond simple benchmark numbers or pricing, one that actually shapes how each model behaves in practice. Kimi K3 currently runs its reasoning process at full effort on every single request, with no option yet available to dial that reasoning intensity up or down, depending on how complex a given task actually is. Claude Opus 4.8, by contrast, allows developers to adjust reasoning effort per request, meaning simple, straightforward questions can be answered quickly and cheaply, while genuinely difficult problems can trigger a deeper, more resource-intensive reasoning process, specifically when that additional effort is actually needed. This distinction explains part of why K3's benchmark numbers look so strong specifically on complex reasoning tasks, since the model is essentially always operating in its most thorough mode. But it also means K3 tends to spend more computational resources, and by extension, more money and more time, even on relatively trivial requests that do not actually require that level of deep reasoning to answer correctly. So where does this actually leave the broader comparison between these two models? The honest, balanced answer, based on the full range of published evidence rather than any single cherry-picked benchmark, is that neither model represents an unambiguous, complete victory over the other. Kimi K3 genuinely does lead on several important, independently verifiable measures, most notably the blind human-evaluated front-end coding arena and its meaningfully lower price point. Claude Opus 4.8 maintains real advantages in areas that matter enormously for production business use, including significantly better factual reliability, more mature and independently validated testing infrastructure built around widely used public benchmarks, and the flexibility to adjust reasoning effort based on task complexity, rather than running every single request at maximum intensity, regardless of how simple the underlying question actually is. Different teams evaluating these two models for their own specific use cases will reasonably reach different conclusions about which one better fits their particular needs, and that kind of genuinely mixed, context-dependent verdict is a far more accurate representation of where these two models actually stand than any single dramatic headline claiming a clean, decisive win for either side. It is worth remembering that this same pattern, a genuinely mixed, nuanced verdict getting flattened into a simpler, more dramatic headline for the sake of attention, repeats itself constantly across technology journalism more broadly, not just in coverage of this specific Kimi K3 comparison. Complex, multi-dimensional evaluations involving dozens of individual benchmarks, methodology caveats, and genuine trade-offs rarely translate cleanly into a single, punchy headline, which creates a persistent incentive for coverage to emphasize whichever individual data point sounds most dramatic, even when that specific number represents only a small, sometimes unrepresentative slice of the full comparison. Approaching stories like this one with that healthy skepticism in mind, actively looking past the headline toward the full underlying evidence, is exactly the kind of habit that separates genuinely informed technology observers from people who simply absorb whichever framing happens to reach them first. It is also worth stepping back to appreciate just how remarkable it is that this comparison is even happening at this level of closeness in the first place. Just 2 years ago, the gap between the leading American AI labs and their Chinese counterparts was frequently described in terms of a full generation of capability difference, with American frontier models clearly, unambiguously, outperforming anything coming out of Chinese AI labs on nearly every meaningful benchmark. According to Stanford's own AI Index research, that gap is now narrowed to somewhere around 2.5% to 3% on some of the most widely referenced capability leaderboards, a genuinely stunning compression of what was previously a much wider lead. Whether that specific narrow percentage holds up perfectly across every possible benchmark or use case E is beside the point. The broader trend is unmistakable, and it has become the subject of increasingly urgent conversation across the entire American technology industry, including notably candid public comments from figures like Hugging Face's own chief executive, who recently stated publicly that China could potentially overtake American labs, specifically in the open weight model category, before the end of this year. Now here is where the quantum computing angle enters this story, and it is genuinely more connected to the AI race than most casual observers initially realize. Throughout 2026, artificial intelligence and quantum computing have increasingly stopped operating as two completely separate technology tracks, and have instead started reinforcing each other in ways that are reshaping how experts think about the broader technology competition between the United States and China. On the pure quantum hardware side specifically, the United States currently maintains a meaningful lead, anchored by Google's Willow quantum chip and IBM's own ambitious quantum computing roadmap. But China has been scaling its own quantum capabilities remarkably quickly, with a processor called Zhuchongji 3.2, recently matching a critical technical milestone known as below-threshold error correction, essentially proving that adding more physical qubits to the system actually reduces overall error rates rather than making them worse, a problem that had plagued quantum computing research for years and had previously led many skeptics to argue that useful, large-scale quantum computers might never become practically achievable at all. That specific error correction breakthrough matters enormously for understanding why 2026 specifically has become such a pivotal year for this broader technology conversation. For roughly a decade, one of the most persistent, most technically serious criticisms of quantum computing as a field was that error rates simply got worse, not better, as researchers tried to scale these systems up toward genuinely useful sizes, seemingly creating an insurmountable ceiling on how powerful any real-world quantum computer could actually become. Once researchers on multiple sides of this technology race demonstrated that error rates could actually be made to improve as systems scaled up, rather than degrading further, it fundamentally changed the calculus around how soon genuinely useful, large-scale quantum computing might actually arrive, shifting the conversation from a distant theoretical possibility toward something companies and governments now feel obligated to actively prepare for on a considerably shorter timeline. Here's the part that directly connects back to the Kimi K3 story and the broader AI race we walked through. Quantum computing and artificial intelligence are increasingly described by researchers as mutually reinforcing technologies, each one accelerating progress in the other. Quantum computers, once they reach sufficient scale and reliability, offer the potential to dramatically speed up certain categories of AI training and inference workloads that classical computers currently struggle to handle efficiently. At the same time, artificial intelligence itself has become an increasingly important tool for designing better quantum hardware, with AI systems helping researchers optimize qubit layouts, error correction schemes, and control systems in ways that would be extraordinarily difficult and time-consuming for human researchers to fully explore manually. This creates a genuine feedback loop, where progress in either field tends to accelerate progress in the other, which is exactly why the same countries currently racing to build the best large language models are simultaneously racing just as hard to build the best quantum computers, treating both as fundamentally connected fronts in the same broader technological competition rather than two entirely separate races running independently of each other. To make this connection a bit more concrete, consider one specific practical example of how this feedback loop actually plays out in real research settings. Training today's largest AI models, systems like Kimi K3 or Claude Opus 4.8, requires enormous amounts of computational power dedicated specifically to a mathematical process called optimization, essentially searching through an almost unimaginably vast space of possible model configurations to find the specific combination of internal parameters that produces the most accurate, most capable model. Certain categories of quantum computing algorithms are theoretically well suited to exploring exactly this kind of vast search space far more efficiently than classical computers can manage, meaning a sufficiently powerful quantum computer could potentially accelerate some of the most computationally expensive parts of training future AI models. Meanwhile, on the flip side of that same feedback loop, current AI systems are already being used by quantum hardware researchers to help design more efficient qubit layouts and more effective error correction strategies. Tasks that involve searching through their own enormous space of possible physical configurations, a search process that modern AI systems have become remarkably good at accelerating compared to traditional manual research approaches, relying purely on human intuition and trial and error experimentation. This convergence has produced some genuinely notable developments just within the past several weeks alone. Amazon recently announced plans to have what the company describes as a genuinely useful quantum computer operational by 2028. Working with quantum company Quera on a system using neutral atom technology, the company's claim, will eventually house more than 10,000 physical qubits while maintaining very low error rates. Whether that specific 2028 timeline proves realistic or ends up slipping, as ambitious technology timelines quite often do, the fact that a company like Amazon is now making concrete, dated public commitments around genuinely useful quantum computing capability signals a meaningful shift in how seriously major American technology companies are now treating this technology, moving well beyond purely experimental research funding toward genuine, near-term commercial deployment planning. China's own approach to quantum computing mirrors, in important ways, a broader pattern of state-directed technology development that has become increasingly familiar across multiple strategic industries. China's quantum computing industry is explicitly organized around coordinated, state-directed national planning, where government contracts, academic research partnerships, and what analysts describe as sovereign strategic ambition are all deliberately coordinated together in ways that differ meaningfully from the more decentralized, venture capital-funded model that has historically characterized American and European quantum computing development. Companies like SpinQ have raised hundreds of millions in funding specifically to advance quantum computing technology and are now positioning for public stock exchange listings within the next year and a half, while major Chinese technology platforms, including Tencent, have established dedicated quantum research labs, explicitly exploring how quantum computing might eventually accelerate their own artificial intelligence and cloud computing operations, reflecting exactly the same AI and quantum convergence being discussed among American researchers and policymakers. There is also a genuinely important security dimension tying these two seemingly separate technology races together that deserves specific attention here. As quantum computing capability continues advancing on both sides of this competition, the encryption standards protecting essentially all of today's digital communication and financial infrastructure face a genuine long-term threat, since sufficiently powerful quantum computers could theoretically break much of today's encryption once they reach adequate scale and reliability. This has already prompted concrete regulatory action in multiple countries. France, for example, recently announced that the government will stop certifying security products that lack what is called post-quantum encryption, a direct, tangible policy response driven specifically by growing confidence that genuinely useful quantum computing capability on either the American or Chinese side of this race may arrive considerably sooner than most people outside of specialized research circles currently expect. France is far from alone in taking this kind of concrete regulatory action, and understanding why multiple governments are moving on this issue simultaneously helps explain just how seriously the harvest now decrypt later threat has come to be taken at the highest levels of government policymaking. When a government agency decides to stop certifying security products lacking quantum-resistant encryption, that decision effectively forces every company hoping to sell security products into that specific national market to begin the often lengthy, technically demanding process of transitioning their existing systems toward new cryptographic standards, regardless of whether those companies personally believe genuinely threatening quantum decryption capability is still years or even decades away. This kind of top-down regulatory pressure tends to accelerate industry-wide adoption of new security standards considerably faster than voluntary adoption alone typically achieves, precisely because it removes the option for individual companies to simply wait and see how the underlying quantum computing race eventually plays out before making their own costly infrastructure investments. Bringing this all back together, what we are really watching unfold right now is a technology competition that increasingly refuses to stay neatly confined within any single category. A Chinese AI lab just released an enormous open-weight model that genuinely competes with, and in several independently verifiable respects, actually beats one of Anthropic's own flagship AI systems, even while still trailing Anthropic's most capable current model overall. At almost the exact same moment, the underlying hardware race in quantum computing has crossed a genuinely important technical threshold, one that both American and Chinese researchers have separately reached in different ways, fundamentally changing how soon experts now expect genuinely useful quantum computing capability to actually arrive. These two races, artificial intelligence capability and quantum computing capability, are no longer separate storylines happening independently of each other. They are becoming genuinely intertwined, each one shaping and accelerating the other, in a competition between two countries that both clearly understand just how much long-term economic and strategic advantage is riding on ultimately winning this broader technological race. If this breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening with the Kimi K3 versus Claude Opus 4.8 comparison, and how it connects to this much bigger quantum computing story unfolding at the exact same time, go ahead and hit that like button, and subscribe if you want more deep dives covering exactly this kind of fast-moving technology competition as it continues to develop. What do you think about all this? Does a result like Kimi K3 narrowly beating Claude Opus 4.8 on certain benchmarks genuinely worry you about America's long-term AI leadership position, especially once you factor in how quickly China also appears to be closing the gap in quantum computing at the exact same time? Or do you think the more nuanced picture we just walked through, mixed results, unverified vendor claims, and Opus 4.8's clear advantages in reliability and maturity, tells a considerably less alarming story than the simplest headline versions of this news suggest? Let me know your honest take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of fast-moving technology story where the full picture genuinely does matter more than any single benchmark number in isolation. There is genuinely no single correct answer here, and reasonable, well-informed observers looking at exactly the same underlying evidence can walk away with meaningfully different levels of concern depending on which specific benchmarks or data points they choose to weigh most heavily in forming their overall impression. Zooming out one final time, it is worth remembering that technology leaderboards, whether measuring large language models or quantum processors, are inherently temporary snapshots of a race that continues to move forward every single week. The specific numbers we walked through today, Kimi K3's 57 versus Opus 4.8's 56, the 76% win rate on blind front-end coding evaluations, the 51% hallucination rate, will all likely look meaningfully different within just a few months, as both companies continue releasing updated models, and as more independent researchers get sufficient time to properly stress test and verify today's headline claims. What matters far more than any single snapshot in this race is the clear underlying trajectory, a genuinely narrowing gap between American and Chinese AI capability, happening at the exact same moment that quantum computing crosses a critical technical threshold on both sides of this same broader competition, creating a technology race unlike anything the world has seen before, one where the finish line itself keeps moving just as quickly as the competitors racing toward it. Thanks for watching this entire breakdown. If you want to stay ahead of stories like this one, covering exactly where the AI and quantum computing race is heading next, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there is a lot more unfolding in this space right now than most headlines ever fully capture. One final thought worth sitting with before you go. It is easy to reduce a story like this one down to a simple, catchy headline, "China beats America," or the reverse framing. America still leads comfortably, but the actual reality unfolding across both artificial intelligence and quantum computing right now is considerably more textured than either of those simple framings suggests. Progress in this broader technology race is not a single race with one finish line and one clear winner. It is dozens of overlapping individually contested fronts, coding benchmarks, factual reliability scores, pricing efficiency, quantum error correction thresholds, and infrastructure deployment timelines, each one moving at its own pace, sometimes favoring American labs and sometimes favoring Chinese ones, often within the very same week. Understanding that genuinely complicated, constantly shifting picture, rather than simply reaching for whichever single headline confirms what you already expected to hear, is exactly what separates a real, grounded understanding of where this technology race actually stands from simply getting swept along by whichever story currently sounds the most dramatic.